This video is on solving quadratic equations, and I've split it into a part 1 and a part 2. So this is just part 1, which gets into the basics as to what a quadratic equation is and how do we solve a very straightforward quadratic equation. So what you need to know is a quadratic equation is an equation that has so what you first need to know is really what an equation is. So you've got to be able to understand, well, if it's just an equation, what am I looking for in the first place? Well, an equation has a left-hand side and it also has a right-hand side, and they are joined by an equal sign. Now, in this topic, we've learned about linear equations, and linear equations, we learned that the highest power that you can have in a linear equation, of the pronumeral that is, will be a 1. So if you look at this equation over here, that x, it looks like it doesn't have a power, but actually does have a power. If we can't see anything, there's an imaginary 1 for the power. So that's a linear equation. With a quadratic equation, the highest power of the variable is actually 2. So we can see in this equation here that we've got 4x squared equals 100. So that is a quadratic equation. So on this next slide, I want you to have a look at all the equations that I've given you, and I want you to circle those that are quadratic. We might even, in this video, we'll highlight, we'll use yellow for the quadratic equations, and we might even do the linear equations in green. So use a bit of thinking time now, because those are the two types of equations you are expected to solve when you are in year 8. So let's have a look. So pause the video if you need a bit more time, choose which ones, categorize your equations, and then unpause to see if your answers are the same as mine. So quadratic equations, I'm looking for a squared in the equation. I must have a squared. I can have lower powers, but I cannot have higher powers. I cannot have a power of my pronumeral higher than a 2. So I can see one over here, that's got 3a squared. That's definitely a quadratic equation. I can see this one over here, u squared equals 100. I can see one more in the second line here. And in the bottom line, I can see a couple actually. I can see this quadratic equation over here with an n squared. And I can see this quadratic over here with another n squared. And finally, this quadratic equation over here. So let's switch over to green for linear equations. Can we see any linear equations? So here I see a 3a that has a power of 1, so that's definitely a linear equation. Can I see any more? Here we go, u equals 3, that's also a linear equation. B equals 8. And one more I can spot. Can you spot the last one? In the bottom row, we've got 2 minus n equals 18. So what are our last two expressions or equations? Well, this one, it has no left-hand side and right-hand side. So this is what we call an algebraic expression. It's actually not an equation. And so because it's not an equation, we cannot solve it. And over here, what I actually have, well, it's not linear and it's not quadratic. It's actually called a cubic equation. And the reason why it's a cubic equation is the highest power of the equation is 3, and that makes it a cubic. All right. So in year 8, the most basic kind of quadratic equation you're going to be expected to solve is this one over here. And if I wanted to read it in words, I would say some number called x. When I square that number, I get 4. And I'm pretty sure if I was in a classroom with you, many hands would fly up and say, oh, I know the number you square to get 4. That number is 2. So why do I have another expression over here where there's another number that I can square to get 4? Can you think of another number that you can square but you'll also get 4? We know that 2 squared is 4. What's the other number? Well, the other number is going to be the negative case. It's going to be negative 2. So you can square two numbers to get 4. You can square minus 2 to get 4, and you can square 2 to get 4. And so therefore this quadratic equation has 2, and we actually call them real solutions. And we're not used to equations having more than one solution. Usually with your linear equations, they only have one solution. So we need to, with our quadratic equations, get used to them having 2 solutions, a positive solution and a negative solution. Why? Because when you square them, that negative solution, well, that negative will disappear. We'll have 2 negatives. negative and a negative, and they will become positive. And so that's why we can have another solution, just like here, my minus 2 squared. When I square the minus 2, the negative becomes positive, and 2 squared is 4, so it also works. So you will be expected to solve equations just like that. If I wanted to make it harder, I could put something like 9b squared minus 1 equals 0. And to solve something like that, really, I need to get b squared to be the subject of the equation. So the thing that I would do first is I would add 1 to both sides, and that gives me 9b squared equals 1. And then I could divide both sides by 9, and that gives me b squared equals 1/9. I can get a fraction. And now I've got to think, well, what do I square to get 1/9? Now this is fraction work. You've got to think of, because this number is a fraction, then my answer also is likely to be a fraction. So what can I square to get 1/9? Well, if I think about what can I square to get 1, I can square 1, and to get 9, I can square the number 3. So if I square 1/3, that means I would square the numerator and I would square the denominator. I will get 1/9. But because it's a quadratic, don't forget I can square positive 1/3, but I can also square negative 1/3. And so that's another example of a quadratic equation, a harder version that you could be asked to solve.